Hello everybody, my name is Dratnos, and in today's video we have War Within Beta. It is up. I already have a video out looking at all of the set bonuses, but we also have the patch notes. Now here are the patch notes. Unfortunately with the patch notes, these are basically like cumulative patch notes for everything that's happened over alpha. So most of, but not all of the stuff in here I've already talked about in previous videos. I've tried to look through this and kind of see if I can figure out which of the things that I haven't yet seen or talked about, but I wasn't able to do it. There's just so much stuff in here, and I'm like 80-90% of it is stuff we've already seen. There is a little bit of stuff here, though, that I have been able to pick out. So some things are new in these patch notes that isn't going to be in this video. And then we're going to look at some stuff that's other than the patch notes as well that is pretty important. So you can use the little chapters at the bottom to navigate here. First off, we do have Trickster hero talent redesign, which this was the one that was based around Feint. And people were like, we don't like that this is based around Feint. And then Blizzard now is changing it so that it's not going to be based around Feint anymore. So Unseen Blade has been redesigned. Sinister Strike, Backstab, Gloomblade, and Ambush and Strato Strike. So that's the first ones are for sub. The second ones are for, well, I guess this is, yeah, Outlaw is just, okay, so Sinister Strike and Ambush or Backstab, Gloomblade, Shadow Strike, right, for sub. Now also strike the target with an Unseen Blade, dealing physical damage. Targets struck are phased for 5 seconds. Phased enemies take 5% more damage from you and cannot parry your attacks. This effect may occur once every 20 seconds. No longer causes Feint to generate combo points and strike enemies around you. So this is a very, very much like, this is now happening basically automatically in your rotation. You're getting your Unseen Blades. You could do a little bit of delaying it, but realistically, you're not going to sit there, not pressing your builders, because then you can't press your spenders either because you need to. So this is just going to be kind of automatically. You're going to be getting your Unseen Blades every 20 seconds. Nimble Flurry has been renamed to Disorienting Strikes. It's been redesigned. Killing Spree and Secret Technique have 10% reduced cooldown. Allow your next 3 strikes of Unseen Blade to ignore its normal cooldown. So you'll be able to just spam some of those. Flawless Form now increases damage with finishing moves by 3% per stack. Duration's been buffed as well, but it no longer grants Mastery. 1,000 Cuts now grants auto attacks a chance to refresh your opportunity to strike with Unseen Blade. Cool. And Flicker Strike now refreshes your opportunity to strike with Unseen Blade as well. Elaborate Twirl's been renamed and redesigned. Outlaw Blade Flurry damage is increased by 10% while Flawless Form is active. Subtlety says basically gives you a little bit of a Blade Flurry for 15%, a 15% Blade Flurry, which is kind of neat. And then Coup de Grace has been upgraded as well. Now causes your Dispatch or Eviscerate to function as if it had spent 4 additional combo points, no longer increasing its damage. But of course, if you spend extra combo points, it will do more damage. So yeah, neat there. That'll tie in with some spec functionality perhaps as well for stuff like keeping Alacrity up or whatever, I guess. Cool. I don't know. I think this looks pretty good. This seems a lot better. This seems now like a hero talent tree that should give you some fun little bits, little damage increase moments, but you don't have to press Feint anymore. The fact that Unseen Blades are just always triggered by your builders means that there's not going to be too much like gameplay around this, right? Like you're not really going to react to, oh, I got 1,000 Cuts proc. Let me do something I otherwise wouldn't do, which is press Sinister Strike or Ambush or Shadow Strike or whatever, any of these buttons. Because you already always were going to be pressing those pretty much at the same times in your rotation. So this one probably won't change how your rotation plays by that much. But I think it has decent potential to change how your rotation feels. We'll see how that ends up working out, though. Okay. Then we also have this note down here, which says DPS trinkets and items with additional effects reduced by 33% for tank and healer specs. And there's a dev note. Tanks and healers are choosing to wear damage trinkets have often seen them contribute a disproportionate and unintended amount of their overall damage. DPS cantrips, such as I assume like Aeronog Ring, Vakash, those kind of things, have further exacerbated this issue. This change is intended to shift power back into players' class kits while reducing the opportunity cost of choosing a specialized tank and healer trinket over pure damage trinkets. This change is not retroactive. This is a change that I'm torn on. On the one hand, if you're, for instance, a tank and you're looking at a damage trinket and you can see something that's like, hey, I proc for some fire damage versus, hey, I give you some crit, right? Tanks generate less damage per point of crit than DPS do. That's one of the reasons that they're doing less damage than DPS do, right? And so they're always a lot less interested in the stat sticks for damage value, although the stat sticks do give them defensive value, whereas the raw damage proc often will do as much raw damage as it does for DPS, which means it does a higher percent of the tank's damage than it does for DPS. And in some cases, it even means like, hey, I'm a tank. The Smolderon trinket has dropped. For me, this is a 11k DPS increase over my next best trinket. Whereas for a DPS player, it's only a 7k increase over their next best trinket because their next best trinket is going to give them stats, right? It's Pip's Emerald Dream Friendship badge, for instance, and that thing has stats on it, which obviously scale more damage for them than they do for me as a tank. Therefore, the way we get the most raid damage is by assigning this DPS trinket to a tank player. So I do think it makes some sense to adjust that and to basically say, like, yeah, the DPS of these effects is going to be less for you, just like how stats are providing less damage for you. On the other hand, those stats are also providing you defensive value, which these trinkets don't do. So in cases where you're this is really trying to make it so that these aren't attractive trinkets for tanks and healers. I think that does make some sense, but I think the bigger problem with tank and healer trinkets is that 9 times out of 10, maybe 8 times out of 10, that they design a tank or healer trinket for defensive value, for healing value, for mana value, those trinkets suck, right? Like, you can look at this season. It's like this season, oh, tanks are putting on the Fire Act trinket, right? DPS players, in fact, are sometimes putting on the Fire Act trinket. The healers are sometimes putting on as well, because that's a strong tank trinket, right? It's a compelling tank trinket. They make a cheat death trinket every few patches. That's often put on as well by tanks, and sometimes by DPS as well. For Race to World First Progression, actually, Echo wore like 8 for Tindral Prog for a while, but that's a pretty niche use case. So when they make good tank trinkets, people put them on. But then they make these tank trinkets that are like, 3-minute cooldown on use. The next 5 auto attacks you take deal 30 less damage to you, and then you explode for fire damage, dealing 10 damage to nearby enemies. And you're just looking at this thing, you're like, what? This trinket wouldn't do anything if I was wearing it in Elwyn Forest questing, and you want me to put it on for endgame play? And so that just leads to you, it's not that you're looking at it and you're like, I'm not going to put on a tank trinket. Let me get me these OP DPS trinkets. Instead, you're looking at it and you're like, well, these DPS trinkets do something. These tank trinkets do nothing. I'm going to put on a DPS trinket. And I suspect that if they make tiers like that, 33% ain't enough. The tank trinkets that are bad. They're like 10% of a regular trinket. So you'll still put on a DPS trinket that's 66% of a regular trinket in those cases. So they really need to make sure that they actually design appealing tank and healer trinkets. There are lots of different types of tank and healer trinkets they can make as well. They can be defensive, they can be absorbs, they can be healing throughput. They can also make tank and healer trinkets that reward you by doing damage for tanking and heal, like for based on damage that you tank, based on healing that you do. And they should be less afraid to restrict those trinkets so that you can only wear them if you're a tank and healer as well. Because oftentimes I feel like they would make those trinkets, except they're scared that they would actually be abused by DPS and DPS would stand in the fire or whatever to get value out of them. Just make it so that's not allowed. And similarly, if they really want to do this as well, they should probably think about the Fire Act trinket being used by healers and DPS players, and think about if they want it to look like that. I actually don't think it's that bad if you do have defensive trinkets like the Fire Act trinket being worn by healer and DPS players for content. I think that can make sense. But at least it can't then just be rolled need on by tank specs. If you're gonna have a trinket like that, it needs to be everybody that actually wants to use it should be able to roll on it. And if instead only tanks can roll on it because they really only want it to be for tanks, well, they've got a problem because it's not just tanks that are using it for high-end content, which is where a trinket like that will always shine. So I see this as they've identified a real issue, and they're taking a step towards improving the situation. But there are some fundamental other changes they need to make, and without making those changes, this is going to make the game worse rather than better, in my opinion. So hopefully those other changes are forthcoming as well. Now, there are some other, again, notes in these changes that are new, but I I can't look through and find them all as of right now. I might try and do that as a project over the next couple of days and then make a video of it where we just look at the actual changes in all of these that haven't already been discussed in previous videos. But yeah, that's not a project that I can undertake today to get this video out. So if you want to have a full look through all of these notes, if you want to catch up on it, I'll put a link in the description below so you can go and read them yourself. Let's look at some other things that are changing here in War Within, though. Up next, we have Earthen, not able to play Death Knight. This is not a big deal, but it's just worth noting that they did say Earthen could play Death Knight at BlizzCon, and they've walked back on this, I assume for lore reasons, because I don't think new Death Knights are being made in the lore right now, because Bolvar's having a little mid-unlife crisis thing. Something like that. So he's kind of backed off making Death Knights for a while. So yeah, looks like that's not going to be possible. And also DH Druid Evoker, but everything else can be an Earthen. Okay. If you had your heart set on being an Earthen DK, which I think makes sense because Earthen are pretty sick, looking DK race, then RIP. But that is the news there. Maybe for lore reasons again. We've also got this description text that has been data mined that says heroic dungeons are not available in Dungeon Finder until War Within Season 1 begins. Now, this has been widely misinterpreted in a lot of cases to mean heroic dungeons are not available until War Within Season 1 begins, but it's actually just not available in Dungeon Finder. So you can still walk to heroic dungeons, I think, in War Within Season 1. It's also worth noting this is just data mined text from this isn't a patch note or anything like that. It's very likely that this is their current plan, but it's a little bit less likely than if they made it a patch note, because it is just data mined failure text. So these sorts of things, sometimes relics of previous ideas that they have since abandoned, still make it into the files like this. But I actually think this makes a lot of sense. Heroic dungeons occupy the place that Mythic Zero dungeons used to occupy in the difficulty curve. Later in a season, being able to queue up for those makes sense. But at the start of a season, if your item level, 500 or whatever it is at the start of this expansion, and heroic dungeons are tuned like M0 dungeons were, random groups created in Group Finder for that would have a pretty high failure rate, and so this kind of just shifts them into being like what M0s were at the start of Dragonflight, where it's like, hey, you want to do heroic dungeons? Form a group, right? And maybe do it with your guildies, or make sure you're forming a group, make sure you actually get a composition that has a bloodlust, maybe a battle res, those kind of things. This is going to make them obviously a little bit less accessible because obviously it's very easy to just go Dungeon Finder, click queue. But I think that it's probably true that if the heroic dungeons are tuned like M0 dungeons were, and they were just queuable like that, there would be a lot of groups that would fail, and that would probably put a lot of pressure on Blizzard to nerf the heroic dungeons, and then basically just have them turn into old heroic dungeons, and then we wouldn't have anything in the space where old M0 dungeons used to be. So I actually think this is a sensible thing, and probably a good change. And you can still queue for normal dungeons, which occupy the space that old heroic dungeons used to, if you're interested in queuable content in those first couple of weeks. So, yeah, I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments of this change. But I think this is probably good friction put into the game. Up next, we have a couple of new visuals. We have a little void transition thing that looks sort of like the Covenant ones. Unclear where this will be used, but maybe in some cases where you release, you'll get this. Or maybe this is just used between some zone transitions or something. I don't know. Some new armor mog, some new UI elements and stuff as well. Some new, backgrounds for some UI frames, stuff like that. Some new icons. Okay. Not a big deal, but I thought this void transition looked pretty cool, so I wanted to include it in this video. And we have Hunter changes, not in this build, but those of you who are looking at first beta build might notice some unannounced changes and or additions to the Hunter class tree. They're part of the Hunter class tree update, which will be included alongside spec trees in next week's beta build. We appreciate your patience and are excited to officially reveal those changes to you soon. So there are Hunter changes coming. Hunter is not going to just be the Dragonflight version of the class with shorter lunge range in War Within. There are changes coming. They're just not in this build. And this is how beta builds work, right? They do a lot of changes for specs in one build and then nothing in other builds. And Hunter, Shaman just turn out to be specs that we're kind of getting them later in the cycle. So hopefully there will be some coming for Shaman sometime soon as well. That'd be cool. That's another class that's in the game. And then finally, we have another little change here to the story mode for Narrowbar Palace that actually looks like it's going to let you go up to 10 players for story mode, which is basically even easier version of the raid than LFR that is really just focused on letting you see the story beats. It's only the last boss, at least for Nerebar Palace, and it's unclear whether it's going to drop loot or anything like that. It's unclear what kind of scaling it's going to have, but it looks like, yeah, they're going to let you go in with more people. I don't see why not. I don't see why, this can't be just any number of players, but whatever number they pick, I'm happy with. That seems fine. Probably will mostly. I expect story mode is mostly going to be used solo or like duo, that kind of stuff. Anyways, but I don't see a downside in letting more people in there. And yeah, still planned to be released at the same time as the final wing of the LFR wing, which you can see my previous video on story mode for some discussion around that. And of course, you can go to twitter.com and then get redirected to x.com and see some more discourse around that decision. Then finally, we have some changes here to Crests in War Within, which is basically just a nerf to the Crest levels that drop from keys. So if you want aspects, which are now called gilded crests, you need to do a 9 or higher instead of 6 or higher. If you want worms, which are now called runed, you'd need to do 4s instead of 2s, but you get them all the way up to 8s. And if you want carved crests, which are drakes, that's still M0, and I guess probably +2s and +3s. And weathered or whelplings crests are heroic, LFR. So pretty much the same, just shifting up worms and aspects by 2 and 3 levels respectively. And yeah, I think this is probably fine. Like, the aspect farm being a little bit harder to do from M+. Farming +6s is a lot easier than killing mythic bosses in the raid. So increasing the difficulty of getting the aspect crest from M+ is probably fair. And also for some players, this is going to mean that a lot of people this season are complaining about inaccessibility of the worms crests and not being interested in running keys that are low enough to drop worms crest or heroic raid. And so now, paradoxically, this nerf might actually help you have some of the keys you do each week incidentally drop worm crest. If you're somebody who plays in that 6 to 8 keystone range, technically you can downgrade your aspects into worms on season 4 if you want, but that feels bad. Whereas just getting some of your keys dropping runed crest, dropping worms crests, might actually be one of those nerfs that in some cases does feel better. But I'm not trying to say this isn't a nerf or anything like that. Clearly this is a nerf, but I think this is sensible. I think this is probably good. M+ was definitely disproportionately easy way to get crests of any difficulty compared to the raid, especially because you get so few per raid boss that you kill, and so I don't want to say so many per key, because especially if you deplete, you don't get very many. But the fact that you only get 10 per raid boss and 12 per key, depending on how difficult the first few bosses are of the raid, depending on how many bosses there are in any given raid, which Nerebar Palace I think is only an 8 bosser, might mean that this sort of nerf helps keep raid feeling good for getting crests, because as it stands, in a lot of cases you could get 1 or 2 degrees of crest higher from the keys that you could run for any given level of raid that you could run. Although, of course, there are a lot of different players that are at different relative levels of the M+ they do and the raid they do. All right, that's it for... Actually, let me just hit Control-Tab one more time, make sure I didn't have an extra tab open that I forgot about. Oh, I did! There's one little bonus piece of content, which is that this is just a little weird thing. If you purchased the physical collector's edition, you haven't got beta access. Beta access isn't included with this, even though I think it would be pretty reasonable to assume it would have been, because it did say it includes everything in the War Within Epic Edition. Now, I guess technically the War Within Epic Edition and the beta access isn't in the Epic Edition. It comes with the digital purchase of the Epic Edition or something. So maybe that's like the way that they can justify saying this and having it not be true. But either way, it feels like they're saying something that's not true with this. Now, there are reasons that it's like this, which is, I guess, that they don't send like a digital code with this and you instead get the code physically, and then you redeem it once this arrives. And obviously these haven't shipped out yet, I think is the reasoning for that. And they have said there is some counterplay to this, which is that you can buy the you can buy the beta access by buying the Epic Edition digitally, and then you'll get a balance credit, which obviously is not as good as getting your money back, but you could use it to pay your sub, and then it is as good as your money. So that is, I guess, a workaround for this that they provided, but this still feels scummy to me. At the very least, I think in future, if they have, if they do the same model in future, I really think that they should include a line here that says, that explains this. That's like basically like, hey, yeah, you're not going to get beta access though, because the beta access comes with the thing that you'd get when it ships. And if you want that, here's the workaround or whatever. Like, I think that should be included here. Obviously, that makes it a less appealing product that they're advertising. But to me, right now, the product that they're advertising is they're lying in here, and that's messed up. So that should be changed. All right. That is actually it for this video. Let me know what you think of all the topics discussed down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.